Hey, what's up? This is Scott with Level Up Tutorials, and in this video, we're going to be covering some basic foundational things for React. We're going to be covering state, we're going to be covering a basic event, and we're going to be covering basic conditionals in JSX, all of which are things you're going to be using constantly in React. So let's get started right now. Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking about state within React components, and state can be used in a whole lot of ways. Sometimes it's keeping track of the value of an input. Other times it's toggling things. Maybe you're opening a navigation or something like that. Maybe it's turning something on or off. But at the end of the day, state is really super useful because it allows you to have dynamic components within your React components without having to pass along props and have props be the cause of that dynamic functionality. Basically, anytime you're doing something like toggling something, you might want to be looking towards state to make that happen. Now, obviously, there are different sort of situations where you might not want to use state. In fact, some people have gone a little bit overboard and have decided to stop using state entirely. However, I cannot recommend to do that, and I definitely think that state has its place within your React components as a very, very useful part of React. So let's talk about how we can start to use state. Now, we're going to do this in a bit modern way here, so if you do not see some examples like this, don't worry, this is a nice new way of doing state. You may have seen state being initial state, that is being set within your constructor, and here we're not going to do that. So this video is going to be talking about a lot of interesting things, and it's going to be a little bit more exciting than the past few videos. So what we want to do is, well, we want to toggle something on or off whether or not we're pushing a button. That seems like a fair way to use state, right? So let's head up to our app component, where it's app extends component, and I'm going to go ahead and first have some text here inside of a paragraph tag, and I'm going to simply just say this should show and hide. Okay, and next, just below it, I'm going to have a button, and this button will be show/hide. Now we'll get over a little bit of why we're doing it this way in a minute, but at this point on our page, we should basically just see this show hide button. Let me bump up the zoom level of this so we can see this a little bit more clearly. Okay, show hide. Look at that, nothing's doing anything just yet. Now we want to go ahead and have a state on this component. So to set the initial value for state, we're going to go ahead and say, just above our render method, we're going to just say state. State is equal to an object. And this is going to set the initial state on the creation of our component. Like I said, you may have seen this being set in a constructor, and that certainly works. However, this is a newer way of doing it that's only going to work with the correct latest syntax and latest Babel configurations. Now, if those words don't mean anything to you, don't worry about that just yet, okay? So what we have here is state is equal to, and I'm simply just going to have the state variable named toggle, okay? Now, this is not a great name because it's pretty generic, but this is going to be generic functionality, so we don't need something very specific. So the toggle, the default state of toggle will be true, because let's say we want this to be visible by default, okay? Now keep in mind, state can have, well, not just Boolean values, it can be strings, it can be anything, right? So setting our toggle here to true doesn't mean you always have to use a Boolean value, true, false, that is. So check this out, we have our default state set toggle to true. And what that gives us inside of our component is access to this dot state. And that is only within this component. That means that if we were to head to welcome and start typing this dot state, we don't have access to this dot state dot toggle because that refers to the component above. That doesn't mean that we can't use this dot state dot toggle within welcome. In fact, we can. I will show you that in a minute here. But what we want to do is head back up here to our app component and see how we can use this. So we want this to be show and hidden by default, right? This should show hide. And we want it to show hide based on the value of toggle. So we can access the value of toggle. Let me put some brackets here and say this dot state dot toggle like this. Okay. Now this will be a Boolean. I'm not sure if this will output as a string. In fact, it looks like it's not because it's a Boolean. But one thing we learn about here in React is how we can do inline conditional statements. So if, else, whatever. And you don't have access to the words if and stuff like that inside of here in any sort of way that you're used to. So if you come from Angular land, or I don't know if Vue does it this way, but Angular, you would have, ngIf or whatever. And React, you don't really have that sort of stuff. But what we do have is the ability to have inline conditionals just by simply using a little trick. And this little trick is ampersand, ampersand, like this. And you may know this double ampersand from conditional statements if you're saying if this and this, right? And the way this works is that it checks to see if this value is true. It says if this.state.toggle is true, and then it hits the next thing because it is true. And the next thing will be something like this should show and hide, like this. Okay, notice how I have a curly bracket, this.state.toggle, ampersand, ampersand, and then our paragraph. So this works right now. It's going to actually show it because what it's doing is it's saying if this is true, which it is, and this, it'll output this, okay? So it seems a little weird. It's not totally, it's correct JavaScript, right? But it's not the way you normally do things. But this is how we do inline conditionals within React. Now, we want to talk about this show hide button because we want to be able to change our state. That's part of the appeal of using state, is that we have it here. And we can change it, and our component will trigger a re-render, and our component will render once more. We mentioned about when components render. It's something that we're going to have to learn a bit about. But what we want to do on our button is add an event. See, I mentioned we're going to be learning a lot of important stuff in this video. So far we've learned inline conditionals, we've learned setting state, default state, and now we're going to learn about events. So this button has an on-click event available. Now, as opposed to a normal on-click event, we have on and then click is in camel case, okay? Now we're going to have an equal sign and then brackets. Now in here, we're going to want to run a method of this particular component. Okay, so this is where things get a little bit interesting because this syntax is pretty new here. So you may not see a ton of examples about it, and you may see sometimes people using some different syntaxes, which I'll go over. But what we want to do is call a method which will just be this.toggle. Okay, and this.toggle is going to be defined within our component here in a minute. But notice how I'm not using parentheses at the end of this.toggle. I'll explain why in a minute. So let's head up top here, and just below state, we can define this.toggle just simply by saying toggle. And toggle is going to be equal to, and get this, it's going to be equal to an arrow function. So we have parentheses, equal sign, greater than, and then curly brackets. So like this. Now, you may see some people writing their methods like this, just like we have our render, and that causes some issues, of which that are maybe a little over the top for learning right now. But just to know that if we're going to be using state, as in this dot state, inside of this, we want to do this as an arrow function like this. Okay, so we have our toggle function, and inside of our toggle, we're going to say this dot set state. Now, set state is a method on our React component that updates our state, and it simply takes an object. Inside of this object will just be the property we want to change and the value we want to change it to. Now, the value we want to change this to, if we're toggling this, is going to just be the opposite of what it already is. So we can get that with exclamation point, this.state.toggle. Okay? So we've defined a method on our component, which we can access with this.toggle. And inside of this method, we're saying, hey, change the state of toggle to the opposite of what it currently is. And then on our button, we're saying, hey, when you click this, run this function. Now, a common misconception is to do something like this. Now, check out what happens when I have the parentheses here and I load my app. See, it's all repeatedly calls state component will update. Okay, so things are messed up here. It's causing an infinite loop. Let me undo this to prevent this infinite loop here. And what's happening is this component renders. When it renders, it runs this function because having the parentheses there causes this function to run. So the function runs, the component decides, hey, the state changed, I must re-render myself. It runs again, and when it renders again, it hits this function, it toggles the state in an infinite state of toggling and untoggling until, you tell it to stop. So by not using the parentheses here, we're telling this method here to not do anything until we tell it to. Okay, so let's come back here, and we should have this toggling working now. Click show hide. Show. Look at that. I mean, this button's jumping. This is a terrible user experience, but what we have here is a working state machine. And what's cool about this is that we can use this.state.toggle to do anything now. We simply just have a variable with a value that's changing. And if that value changes, it's going to trigger a re-render. Now, what's fun about this is that our welcome component can even get access to this state and its changes simply by passing it as a prop. So if we were to put some sort of prop like toggle is equal to this.state.toggle, then you can see here that this value, anytime it updates, will also update inside of our welcome component, causing a refresh or re-render on this component. So this is something that's really important and something you'll probably do all the time, at least passing state or props into other components. So we would now have access to this state in here, but we wouldn't access it as this.state because this.state refers to the state of this particular component. We would access it as a prop. As just like we access text, we could say toggle, and then we would have access to toggle here. Let's go ahead and do a console log CLG here, and we can say toggle. Okay, check this out. When I come to React here, I'm gonna open up my dev tools. If you don't know about dev tools here, all we simply need to do is right click and inspect element. All we need to do is right click and select inspect. Here you can see our default value has been passed, and on the initial render it's set to true. Now it's been triggered a re-render, set to false, true, false, true. And keep in mind that this logging is coming from this.props.toggle and not this.state. Granted, they are the same thing, but you can see that it is staying, in fact, one-to-one in tune, and every single time it triggers a re-render of our subcomponent. So check it out. This is very, very basic, but we have working state here, and that's excellent. Like I said, we can use state for all sorts of stuff, and many times you'll use it just to simply control an input. You use it maybe for your navigation, hamburger menus, you use it to toggle things all the time, and it's definitely generally used for stuff like that. But in addition, in this series, we're also going to be using it to store our data once we hit an API. So you'll definitely get a lot of practice setting and unsetting state. So that's not the last we'll see of state, and certainly not the last we'll see of inline conditional statements like this. We'll even do some fancier ones later, or what we'll see of actually writing methods on our components or setting state initially. So as always, this is Scott with Level Up Tutorials. If you want to learn more about React as we build out this really super cool application, head to store.leveluptutorials.com and purchase this series outright, or become a pro and get access to streaming, or download all the code, download the videos, and check it out. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.